So here it is, the new McLaren GT. This is a massive deal for McLaren. These guys are truly entering a new product category. Now, interestingly, this is technically the third GT car that McLaren have developed. Way back in the day of Bruce McLaren, who founded the company, he launched a car called the M6 GT. They only made 3 of those cars. It was the intention to become a production car, but sadly that never came to fruition. And then fast forward all the way to 2016, and McLaren evolved the 570S platform and created the 570 GT. It was a slightly softer ride, and not quite as edgy and sporty. And the unique feature of the 570 GT was the rear deck lid would articulate and open, giving you access to the rear, which was resculpted so that you could more easily drop bags into it. Now, the success of the 570 GT was such that McLaren decided to respond in full force and introduce a proper GT car. It's been in development for nearly 3 years, and here we are today, giving you the very first look at an entirely new car and product category for McLaren.
All right, so really the main differentiating point of this car is, of course, the massive capacity of the boot. Behold this vast cavern of luxurious space. Look at that. It's actually deceiving because it looks quite shallow, but it's incredibly deep. So if you look right here, it's much more recessed than it is in the center. However, there is this sort of scallop section here for if you're going to put your golf bags or your skis. Apparently 2 sets of skis will fit in there with boots. And then on the other side, there is a more recessed area for your more conventional bags. Conveniently close this. Automated, of course. Right, I'm going to show you in the front, but as we work our way around, we might as well talk about new wheels and new features, etc. So, interestingly, we've got 20-inch at the front, 21 inches at the rear. These are the optional diamond cut 15 spoke. Working our way down the side, integration / removal of door handle. Ultimately, it's to create a cleaner line down the side of the car and to not interrupt airflow going into the air intake here. But look at this, how this activates. That is how you activate the door handle. I think that's a gorgeous integration. So you might have noticed as well when we were looking at the size of the new wheels that this is running a more conventional steel disc brake setup. There is, of course, the option of the lighter weight carbon ceramic brakes. And as we move around to the front, I shall show you the next contribution to that 570 litres of luggage capacity. I mean, it's huge, it's deep, it's big, combined with the space in the rear. I actually don't know anything quite like it, not certainly with this performance. Okay, so while we're round the front, I think it's a pretty good opportunity to just give you a demonstration of this ride height that we're not used to seeing from McLaren. This is 110 mil. So the idea being that when you're approaching a speed bump or going down a steep ramp in a car park, it's going to deal with the day-to-day stuff that you're trying to navigate. But if you do come across something that's extra steep or extra bumpy, you can press the axle lift and it'll increase ride height even further to 130 mil. Pretty much deal with anything with that ride height. And I'm sure you've picked up on the revised headlight design as well. Still the familiar McLaren tick architecture, they've just sort of toned it down a notch. And this splitter right here, while it is in this gorgeous black gloss finish, of course will be available in carbon fiber, and the same goes for the diffuser at the rear too. While we conveniently have the door open, I was mentioning the evolution of the quality of the materials and the design on the interior. One feature being the, I guess, detail and lighting on this chrome panel here. Now, while the lights are up, you might not be able to see it, but it's a technology called hidden until lit. So you might be able to see it when the lights are down. Look at that. A little logo and detail that comes through on the panel to open the glove box, which, by the way, now is a touch sensitive button. So they've just added all these little bits of details in there which have just heightened the experience somewhat. It's very cool.
So the brief of this car is fascinating. It's supposed to have more space, more luxury, more comfort, but essentially it has to provide competition levels of performance with continent crossing capability. So it has to be fast, but smooth. And I think McLaren have a very strong track record of making things fast, and they did a pretty good job of making things smooth with the 570 GT. But this car is entirely revised. Let's start with the engine. Now, it still retains that twin turbocharged 4-litre V8. However, the torque curve of that engine has been remapped to develop a more linear, progressive torque curve throughout the entire rev band. That character is more applicable and more suitable to a Grand Tour. It just gives a more effortless, smoother driving experience. It's not quite as aggressive on the acceleration as something like a 720S. However, the car does have practically 620 horsepower and 630 newton meters of torque. So this thing is not going to hang around. In fact, in its class, and this is going up against cars like the Aston Martin DB11 and even the Porsche 911 Turbo and Ferrari's Portofino. Those cars have actually come from McLaren's presentation. They are not afraid to acknowledge the competition in this space, and as such have benchmarked themselves against those cars. I mean, that is really going in deep on the competition, because those cars in their space have been fairly dominant, and now McLaren have come in with a completely new car, completely new platform, and judging by the weight of the car and the power and the practicality, there's over 570 litres of luggage capacity in this car. Now you're probably thinking, what does that mean? As a spot of context, that is more luggage space than a Ford Focus with the back seats down. And yet this is pitched as having supercar levels of performance with genuine practical car levels of luggage capacity. I mean, if you look in the back there, it has a very long extended rear canopy. I've never actually seen a rear architecture quite like it. It's really deep. It looks like you could probably lie down in there. So the idea is that this car is very much designed for distance. The interior has been revised. It still has 570 DNA in its design, but I'm actually picking up elements of Speedtail in this car. The attention to detail on the interior, but these guys seem to just step up the game every single time. The interior quality is outstanding. Everything that you interact with, very tactile and crisp. It feels wonderful. And that's the idea of this car. One of the main bits of feedback from 570 GT clients was that it was very cool, but what they would love is a GT product that is distinctly different to the other product offering, where the 570 GT, clue in the name, was very heavily based on the 570S. This is an entirely new product. And what that means is McLaren have had to develop a new chassis too. So still building on their famous carbon tubbed architecture, it's now running monocell 2-T, T standing for touring. So the whole underpinning and architecture has been built from day one, ground up, to take Grand Touring in mind, hence that massive amount of space it's got. But the main differentiation is going to be how this car drives. Now, in comparison with the suspension setup on their sports and Super Series cars, the new GT car is running Pro-Active damping control. The GT platform has completely new suspension and Pro-Active damping control, which takes normal active dampers that usually responds as it hits the bumps, but it actually prepares the suspension in advance depending on the surface of the road. So this is really reading the road surface and preemptively creates the optimal ride quality dependent on the surface you're on. It's very trick stuff, and I'm told it has transformed the ride quality and experience of what it's like to drive this car, particularly from the passenger experience inside. Importantly, because the brief was to cross continents like a missile, but still retain the approach to performance driving that McLaren is so famous for, you'll be pleased to know that they have still retained the hydraulic steering rack. So expect tactile feedback through the wheel. So back to the power of the engine. Basically 620 horsepower, with the weight of the car coming in at around about 1,530 kilograms. What this is expected to achieve is a 0 to 62 in 3.2 and 0 to 200 kilometers an hour in 9.5 seconds. So once again, that's where this is class leading. There is no package that offers that amount of luggage capacity, this interior luxury, and that kind of performance. Equally based around a carbon structure that weighs 1,530 kilograms. With this amount of luxury, wrap your head around that. It's pretty bonkers stuff. So even though there has been emphasis put on the way this car will handle and feel and still retain the McLaren DNA when it comes to performance, where the priorities of performance have been engineered in this car is, of course, straight line speed, because that's what Grand Touring is all about. It's about destroying continents on your way to your destination. And so the engine mapping and the characteristics of the power delivery have been developed to create a relaxed and refined driving experience. But when you mash your foot, it does the well-established trick now of the McLaren reality distortion field, where your peripheral vision becomes a bit blurry as the rest of the environment just flies past your head. If it's anything like a 720S or even a 570S, this thing is going to be ridiculous, and you can do it all while carrying your clubs. Now, one of the important things of a Grand Tourer is, of course, the refinement of the gear shifts. Now, in the 570S and 720S, when you shift gears, it has been calibrated to give you a sort of reassuring thud, just to let you know that that car has slammed home with a spot of enthusiasm. But in this, it has a seamless shift, so it will be truly an audible tone change of indecipherable cog manipulation. Now, new for McLaren, we have a switchable exhaust. So if you put it into different driving modes, say for example you want to start it up early in the morning before you swan on down to the south of France, and you don't want to particularly upset the residents or the nearby wildlife, you can have it in a relatively sedate exhaust tone. But I've just had a sample of it with the valves open. Dare I say it, this is, in fact, I will clarify, this is the best sounding McLaren so far, certainly under idle, and we did have a few exhaust blips. There is this deep, guttural, bassy tone which I've never heard from a McLaren before. I reckon under load, this thing is going to sound incredible. And I actually hope that they take some of the learnings from this and apply it to future cars. Because honestly, I know it's hard to capture the sounds of things truly and properly through a microphone and then through your speakers. Take it from me, this is the best sounding McLaren so far. I know that sounds crazy, but whatever they've done with the exhaust engineering is sublime. So also, one of the character traits of a heavily turbocharged engine can be lag. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the 570 or 720 has lag, but there is evidence of boost building. They're still low inertia, but the way that the turbos deliver the power, I guess I could say has been engineered to assist with the drama. So you're aware when it comes on cam and you have this massive boost that just propels you down the asphalt. With this, there's further emphasis on the super low inertia turbos. And so the characteristics of the engine, I've been told, has been designed that there's very little turbo lag and that the engine picks up with instant response. And that's once again what this car is all about. It's an effortless nature, something you don't have to think too much about. So when you're on long journeys, or even just facing, tight corners, you don't necessarily need to have to drop it down a few cogs. It's going to be able to lean back on that 630 Newton meters of torque and effortlessly spool up and throw you towards the next apex. Something, once again, I'm really intrigued at, because the wheelbase on this is slightly longer as well. So it'll be fascinating to see how it feels compared to the original McLaren DNA. And something else you might not think about, the brake servos and brake pedal feel have also been revised. Essentially, think of them as being less grabby. There is often a trait in high performance cars, because they've got so much power and often quite a bit of weight when it comes to a Grand Tourer, that the brakes really need to do their thing. But what that can result in, particularly around town or when you're driving slower, is that they can be a bit grabby and snappy. So when you're around town, stopping and starting, you can kind of be doing this a lot. In this, I've been told that McLaren have revised the master cylinder and the brake feel and the bite, so it's just a much more enjoyable, progressive application of the brake pads. Now, I was speaking of design traits which have filtered their way down from Speedtail, and none other than the electrochromic glass. So with the touch of a button, you can transform this massive window in the roof to be pretty much opaque or entirely transparent. Very cool that they filtered it down from Speedtail so soon, because this car is starting at £165,000. That's before options. No small change, don't get me wrong, but they introduced this technology on Speedtail, which is many millions of pounds. Oh, and by the way, you'll still be able to transport your skis up the mountain at over 200 miles an hour. Now, as I mentioned earlier, McLaren were not shying away from the fact that there are other well-established competitive brands and products which sit in this space. And so they've actually benchmarked themselves against those products on things like interior sound noise. So for example, they've taken the DB11 and the 911 Turbo, and it turns out that they are 4 decibels quieter on the inside than those two cars. Now, 4, the number 4 doesn't sound a great deal, but when in the terms of decibels, that's huge. I don't know how they've achieved that. Obviously, some more NASA space tech when it comes to sound deadening. Yeah, but 4 decibels is actually a dramatic amount of noise reduction. So I'm going to be very intrigued to see how they've achieved that, because my time spent with a 720S, I would say actually one of the largest criticisms is the ambient road noise, particularly from the tyres. That is one of the, I guess, compromises of having such a rigid carbon tub. You do get a lot of resonance through it that can have that side effect. But with this, apparently they've quashed that. Importantly, they have also revised the infotainment as well, still retaining a Super Trick Bowers & Wilkins sound system, but they have, hooray, improved the sat-nav, teaming up with a company which develops infotainment for the likes of Audi and Mercedes. They have created a version for McLaren, and it's now in a revised touchscreen with more features, more apps, and just more in-depth and, I guess, intuitive sat-nav and infotainment that, well, actually works. On that note, as always, comments below. I want to know what you guys want to know about this entirely new car from McLaren. It's very exciting indeed to see somebody challenging the Grand Tourer space, which has been so dominant from the likes of Aston and Porsche and Ferrari as well. I mean, I would even put the 812 Superfast in this category, even despite the fact that the price is so disproportionately different. Don't forget the performance and practicality that this thing offers, certainly on paper, is so compelling that I don't think you can ignore those cars, even though McLaren are pitching this against the Portofino. So let's see how it is when we drive it. Leave your comments below what you would like to see. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you next time. Ciao.